Last week, we began a series on direct-to-device connectivity. Our May 27th episode was called Direct-to-Device, the End of the Tower-Only Era. And the basic premise of that was simple. Satellite-to-phone connectivity doesn't mean the death of terrestrial networks, but it does mean that coverage is becoming layered. Space and ground are beginning to operate as a hybrid broadband architecture, and that changes the broadband carrier and public safety resilience conversation. But that was part one. This is part two, and where we start to get into the uncomfortable part. Go figure. What happens to the infrastructure that still works but no longer may make financial sense? What happens when a carrier looks at a rural tower and says, yeah, that's technically still providing coverage, but do we still need to pay for that? And what happens when a backhaul route, a microwave link, a remote shelter, generator, or rooftop lease becomes less attractive? Because there's now another coverage layer in the sky. That's what's called the stranded infrastructure problem. And for public safety, it's not just a business story. Because a lot of times the asset that looks weak on a spreadsheet is also the one that saves your bacon. Especially during a storm, wildfire, flood, fiber cut, cyber attack, or large-scale outage. So, in other words, the question is not, does it still work? The question is, who's going to pay to keep it working? And that's coming up next on TiPS, Today in Public Safety.
Welcome to TiPS, Today in Public Safety, your go-to podcast for today's breaking stories and public safety news. Here's your host, Fletch, with today's tips.
Welcome to TiPS, Today in Public Safety. This is Fletch, I'm a NENA certified EMP, and every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I bring in the latest, most informative, and sometimes controversial takes on emergency communications. Today, I want to continue our direct-to-device series. Last Wednesday, on May 27th, we opened the series with Direct-to-Device, the End of the Tower-Only Era. And that episode made the case that D2D is not about killing towers, but about adding a new space-based layer to the existing coverage model, and it's changing how we think about broadband, rural connectivity, and public safety resilience. This week, we move into part two, the stranded infrastructure problem. And before anyone gets too nervous, let me say this once again. Towers are not dead. Fiber's not dead. Microwave isn't dead. Neither is backhaul or rooftop sites. Actually, terrestrial networks are far from being dead. Trust me, nobody needs to lower the flag to half-mast while someone plays taps on a packet-switched trumpet. But the economics are changing. And when the economics change, infrastructure starts to get reevaluated. And that is where this gets interesting, because communications infrastructure doesn't just exist because it's technically useful. It exists because someone pays for it. Someone pays for the tower. Someone pays for the lease. Someone pays for the backhaul. And somebody's got to pay the power bill as well as maintenance. Even though the tower's in the air, there are assets on the ground like the shelter, the generator, new batteries, the truck roll to fix it, and the access road up to that mountaintop, as well as the monitoring system, the insurance that's required, and whatever else quietly keeps that whole thing alive. But that's not stuff that we think about on day-to-day services. So once direct-to-device connectivity becomes part of the coverage conversation, even if it's in a limited way, some of those costs are going to be questioned. Not everywhere, not all at once, and not tomorrow morning, but over time. And when that happens, some infrastructure may become stranded. Still useful, still functional, still sitting there doing its job, but no longer financially attractive for the people expected to keep paying for it. And that is the stranded infrastructure problem. And it's something public safety needs to pay attention to. It still works is not the same as it still makes sense. Let's start with some basic business reality. Infrastructure can be technically functional, but financially fragile at the very same time. That's true for cell towers, for microwave links, it's true for fiber routes, and especially true for rural backhaul. And it's true for rooftop leases. Then you got things like batteries, shelters, land leases, as well as those maintenance contractors. So even though a site can still pass traffic, a tower can still provide coverage, and a circuit can still carry data, that generator can still start and a microwave path will still connect to points that are otherwise a nightmare to reach. But it doesn't automatically mean someone wants to keep paying for it. And that's the part that people miss a lot of times. In telecom, infrastructure usually has to justify itself in one or more ways. Either coverage, capacity, revenue, regulatory obligation, contractual obligation, as well as redundancy, strategic value, and public safety value. The problem is that those categories don't always carry the same weight. Commercial planning tends to favor measurable return. How many users, how much traffic, how much revenue, and how much will it cost? What's the churn risk, the competitive pressure? And those are all valid questions. No carrier, tower owner, or infrastructure company can run forever on sentimental attachment to steel that's stuck in the ground. But public safety often has a very different question, like what happens when things go sideways? Because that rural tower may not carry huge traffic on a normal day. That backup route may look redundant on a normal day. The generator maintenance contract just looks like a cost line item on a normal day. So that remote site may look pretty inefficient on a normal day. But public safety, they don't live in normal days. They live in the storm, the flood, the wildfire, the hazmat incident, or the mass casualty event. And then we got things like the cyber attack, the fiber cut, the evacuation, the grid failure. And the day everyone tries to call it once because something very bad just happened. And then suddenly that inefficient piece of infrastructure suddenly becomes the thing that everybody wishes they had not quietly allowed to disappear. And that is the risk. Direct-to-device may reduce some commercial pressure to maintain some marginal terrestrial assets. But some of those marginal assets may still have resiliency value. And resilience value is not always captured in a quarterly business review. Yeah, I know, shocking, but apparently spreadsheets do not automatically understand chaos. I think somebody needs to file a feature request on that one. Coverage becomes layered, and the math gets messy. The old coverage model was pretty simple to understand. Not easy to build, but easy to understand. It wasn't cheap, it wasn't politically simple, but conceptually it was pretty straightforward. Need coverage? Build terrestrial infrastructure. Put up a tower, add antennas, light up the backhaul, get power, harden the site, and maintain the site. Be sure to pay the lease and fight through zoning issues, while trying to explain to the public that the tower providing the cell service they demand cannot also be invisible, silent, free, environmentally neutral, and located somewhere else. You know, the usual telecom magic trick. That model created an enormous ecosystem. Carriers, tower companies, fiber providers, microwave providers, site acquisition firms, engineering and construction crews, as well as equipment vendors, power companies, local landlords, municipalities, backhaul providers, maintenance contractors, and the ability to make cellular antennas look like natural foliage 365 days a year. And there was probably at least one guy named Gary who knows where the backup generator key is because nobody else has seen it since 2014. Direct-to-device doesn't erase that ecosystem, but it changes the pressure that's around it. Because once satellite connectivity becomes another access layer, coverage planning becomes layered. You'll still need terrestrial networks for capacity. You're still going to need towers for dense usage. And you're still going to need that fiber for transport. Critical services are going to need hardened networks. And for the foreseeable future, public safety solutions are going to include things like radio systems. And microwave is going to take care of places where fiber is impractical or vulnerable. So you're still going to need local infrastructure where capacity, reliability, latency, and control all matter. But D2D has the potential to cover some edge cases well enough to change investment decisions. And that's the phase that matters. Well enough. D2D doesn't have to be perfect to change the math. It only has to be good enough for certain use cases in certain places under certain conditions. Good enough for emergency messaging. Good enough for basic connectivity. Good enough to reduce pressure to build a new rural site, and good enough to delay an upgrade, as well as make a marginal tower less attractive. This is where it becomes good enough for an investor to ask, what are we spending money on all the time? And when that happens, the conversation starts to change. Now, some assets will still be essential, some will still be profitable, and some will be strategically important. Some will still be required by regulation, contract, or operational necessity, but for others, they may start drifting into the danger zone. Still working, still useful, but financially exposed. Kind of like me. And that's how infrastructure becomes stranded. Not because it fails, not because the business case around it doesn't work, but because the business case has changed. The public safety risk is quiet degradation. So the biggest part of public safety risk here may not be the dramatic event. It might be quiet degradation. A tower lease is not renewed. A backup route is removed. A rural site doesn't get upgraded. Maybe a generator replacement is delayed, or a microwave link is allowed to age out. Things like hardening projects might get postponed. A local provider loses enough revenue that maintenance starts to slow down. A shelter stays in service, but nobody wants to invest in it. And that site remains technically operational, but a little less resilient each year. Nothing explodes, nothing makes headlines, nobody holds a press conference, but the network just gets a little thinner, and then a little more fragile. And then more people depend on assumptions that nobody ever wrote down clearly. And eventually, the failure shows up during the worst possible moment. That's the public safety concern. Not that direct-to-device is bad. It's not. D2D is a powerful resilience tool. It can help fill those coverage gaps. It can provide another path where terrestrial services are not an option. And it can help support emergency communications in remote areas. And not only will it help public safety communicate, but it can help people reach help, where help has been something that was unreachable in the past. That's good. That's really good. But one new layer should not be an excuse to neglect another layer, because resilience is not just one thing. Resilience is layers: terrestrial wireless, satellite, fiber, microwave, public safety radio, backup power, diverse routing, local control, operational procedures, as well as testing, training, and governance. Oh yeah, and the humans who know how the system actually works when the diagram stops being helpful. Direct-to-device should strengthen the resilience stack. It shouldn't become a permission slip to hollow out terrestrial infrastructure without understanding the consequences. That is the danger. A carrier may see cost savings, a tower owner may see tenant risk, and a backhaul provider may see declining demand. Municipalities will start seeing reduced private investment, and public safety agencies may see coverage that appears just fine until the emergency happens. And everybody may be technically correct from their own perspective. That is what makes this complicated. No single party may be acting irresponsibly, but the combined result may still reduce resilience. And that is why public safety needs to be in the conversation and in there early. Not after the site's gone, not after the contract is canceled, and not after the outage report says unexpected coverage limitations were observed. That's corporate language for whoops. And in public safety, whoops is not a continuity strategy. Reality check. Resilience is not always profitable. Look, here's the reality check. Resilience is not always profitable. In fact, often it's not. At least not in the simple, immediate, spreadsheet-friendly way that people like to measure things today. Redundancy costs money. Backup power costs money. Hardening costs money. Diverse routes cost lots of money. Rural sites cost a ton of money, and low-use infrastructure costs money every month. Then you've got maintenance costs, testing costs, keeping systems alive for those very rare but high-impact events costs money. And all of that creates a huge problem because commercial networks are not charities. They're businesses. They've got shareholders, investors, customers, debt, competition, capital investment plans, and financial targets that they need to hit. That's the reality of it. But public safety can't pretend that market forces automatically preserve resilience. They don't. Markets preserve what markets value, money. Public safety often needs things that are hard to monetize until after they fail. That's the tension. Sure, a rural site might not be profitable, but it may be absolutely necessary. Backup routes won't get used every day, but it's going to be critical during a disaster. A hardened facility might look expensive, but then the difference between that service and silence is huge. The challenge is who figures out who recognizes that value, who pays for it, and who is the accountable person when it disappears. That's where policy, regulation, contracts, public-private partnerships, as well as state and local planning all start to matter. Because if public safety resilience depends on infrastructure, the moment the commercial market no longer wants to support that cause, somebody needs to notice before it becomes a problem. Now, that doesn't mean every old asset gets saved. There should be some that are retired. Some should be replaced. Some should be consolidated. And some should be modernized. Some will be transferred to new uses, and some will be part of a hybrid architecture. But all of those decisions need to be intentional, not accidental, not invisible, not buried inside of a budget line, and definitely not based on the assumption that satellite coverage from space will magically erase every terrestrial weakness, because it doesn't. No, D2D is a new layer. It's not a force field. The bottom line. Stranded does not always mean worthless. Here's the no-nonsense bottom line on this. Direct-to-device connectivity is changing the coverage conversation. Last week we talked about the end of the tower-only era, not the end of the tower era. This week we're talking about what happens next. When coverage becomes layered, infrastructure value changes. Some tower sites may become less critical. Some backhaul routes are going to be less attractive. Some rural sites are going to become harder in order to justify. And some local infrastructure companies are going to start to feel pressure. Even municipal and regional planning and their assumptions is going to need to be revisited. But stranded doesn't mean it's worthless. An asset can lose commercial value and still have resilience value. A site can be financially marginal, yet still provide operational importance. And a route can be very lightly used until the day it becomes essential connectivity. And a tower can look pretty unnecessary until the day a disaster proves otherwise. And that's where public safety just can't ignore this major shift. D2D is going to bring enormous benefits, more coverage, more redundancy, more options, and more ways for people to reach help. There'll be more possibilities for resilient communications, but it also changes the incentives. And incentives are what shape infrastructure. If we're dead set on having a resilient communications future, we need to make sure the infrastructure decisions are not being made only by asking what works or what looks efficient in a normal spreadsheet. If we want a resilient communications future, we need to start to make sure that the infrastructure decisions are not made only by asking what works on a normal day or what looks efficient in a spreadsheet. No, we need to ask what survives the bad day, what supports our first responder, and what helps the caller, and what keeps the ECC alive and connected. Because that's what's going to give the public another path to help when the first path is a dumpster fire. So the future isn't space versus ground, it's space plus ground. But if we're not careful, the move towards hybrid coverage could unintentionally weaken the terrestrial resilience layer that we still need. So yeah, direct-to-device is exciting. Yeah, it changes broadband and emergency comms. It opens new possibilities, but as the coverage model evolves, we need to pay attention to what gets left behind. Because it still works is not the same thing as someone's going to keep paying for that, right? And in public safety, we don't want to have to discover that difference in the middle of the emergency. That wraps up this episode of Tips Today in Public Safety. This is Fletch. Thanks so much for listening. Be sure to like and follow, and we'll catch you next time. Take care. Hey, it's Fletch. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you learned something new. Remember to catch all of my previous episodes of Tips Today in Public Safety, published every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on most social media platforms and streaming 24/7 at 911tips.com. My blogs are located at fletch.tv and my personal website is at fletch911.com. Remember to like and subscribe. It really helps out the algorithms. And if you're in public safety, thanks for what you do every single day. We'll catch you next time. Take care.
You've been listening to TiPS, Today in Public Safety, your go-to podcast for today's breaking stories and public safety news. Hosted by Fletch and available every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Catch past episodes on 911tips.com. Be sure to like and subscribe, and remember to join us each week for the latest on NG 911. I am Spider Harrison, the official 911 voiceover dude. Catch me on Sirius XM on various channels, including 90s on 9, the 10 spot, and on the Weekend Countdown on Hits 1. Or don't regret it for the rest of your life. Either way, I'm good.